Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back in our episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Pete Hegseth wants the DC Circuit to let him punish a senator for criticizing him from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be punishing people for criticizing the government, but ultimately, the government's in a position to justify whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Bernie Sanders. If you paid $1 in federal income taxes this year, you paid more than Walt Disney, Citigroup, CVS, Kohl's, Ticketmaster, Tesla, United Airlines, GoDaddy, PayPal, Palantir, Roku, HP, 3M, PG&E, Halliburton. That's absurd. We need real and progressive tax reform. Posted by John Key, and that's a cross post from the Moss subreddit, and that looks like a tweet from Bernie Sanders who just said just that, I guess. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if you don't want to pay taxes, you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes regardless of how big you are. If you're a megacorp, you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes, or if you're a small, poor individual, regardless of how rich or poor you are, you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes if you don't want to. Ultimately, I think I think if people want to pay taxes, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to, so if they don't want to. I also think, if they are forced to pay taxes, they should at the very least be able to earmark what their money goes to, rather than have the state just throw it all around all willy-nilly. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Iranian gunboats fire on tanker in Strait of Hormuz as Iran reimposes restrictions. The American presidential shit show continues, from msnews.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for all the Iran drama, but the U.S. always has to be getting involved in drama somewhere else in the world. I think the libertarian position is, you gotta put America first and your own country first, rather than constantly try and police the world. But that's what Trump campaigned on. He said America first on the campaign trail, but ever since he's gotten into office, it's been Israel first. And just go to show you that, the United States is just going to police the globe regardless of which figurehead is in the White House. Next, we have, will Trump's next tariffs be a sham too? From Cato.org, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tariffs, but I think the libertarian position is, if you want to pay tariffs, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to pay them if you don't want to. Same with the rest of taxes in general, I would say. Next, we have the United States has a progressive tax system, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said a post that the Economics Writing Every Day shares estimates of how progressive the U.S. tax system is, drawing primarily from published academic work. These papers all agree as income rises, average tax rates rise. Outside of the academic work, even the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, a more left-leaning think tank, shows a progressive system. Per their estimate, the lowest quintile pays about half the effective tax rate as the top 1%. But back to the academic work, one particularly interesting approach calculated the remaining lifetime tax rates net of transfers, so accounting for cash assistance, food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. The tax system is even more progressive when considered this way, with the lowest quintile actually getting a significant net subsidy, they age 40 to 49 cohort shown. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to have a progressive tax system, I think the libertarian position is voluntary taxation. If you don't want to, we live in a culture based off consent. If it's when it comes to sex, food, pretty much everything, it's all based on consent. But suddenly, when it comes to taxation, the government can tax you even if you don't consent to it, and I think that's very anti-libertarian. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump ended free trade for Mexican tomatoes. Prices are up to 23% in the last year from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, I think people should buy local, but if people do want to buy their tomatoes from Mexico, they should be able to buy food from wherever you want to buy food. And you shouldn't have any extra taxes or tariffs on it, because that's the free market. The free market, the free market doesn't have taxes or tariffs. It has just what are people willing to buy and how much can you ship it and produce it for. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rate My Tax Plan That Makes You Pay $0 in Income Tax, hosted by Jacob Anders. And that's that they said TLDR, zero tax on the first $300,000 you earn, 15% flat tax only on income above that. Corporations could go back to paying 35% for Trump. I chose 42. Income tax turn system 2023 numbers 2.109 trillion. 2028 flat system 50% income over 300,000, 1.86 trillion. Result $303 billion less. And yeah, personally, and they had some other stuff as well. I think the libertarian position is, you shouldn't pay taxes regardless of how much money you earn. But I do think this would be a step in the right direction. If you earn for 300,000 and you don't want to pay any taxes on it, you should be able to. But I do think you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes regardless of how much you earn, even if it's above 300,000. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have one thing every modern president has in common. They all spent more than the last guy from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. And yeah, personally, just go to show you that the U.S. government's going to spend it like there's no tomorrow, regardless of which figurehead's in the White House. The Republican Party might market itself as fiscally conservative, but it doesn't really matter which of the parties in the White House. They're both going to spend like there's no tomorrow and have the U.S. police the world. And personally, I think neither of those are that libertarian. Next, we have No More Mr. Nice Guy Friends, War Crimes Again, posted by Giant Porcupine, and that's the truth from Donald Trump. I ran inside to fire bullets yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz, a total violation of our ceasefire agreement. Many of them were aimed at a French ship as a ferry from the United Kingdom. That wasn't nice, was it? My representatives are going to Islamabad, Pakistan. They'll be there tomorrow evening for negotiations. Iran recently announced that we're closing the strait, which is strange because our blockade has already closed it. They're helping us without knowing, and they are the ones lose the closed passage. $5 million a day. The United States loses nothing. In fact, ships are headed right now to the U.S., Texas, Louisiana, Alaska to load up competitions of the RRGC. RRGC always wanting to be the tough guy. We're offering a very fair and reasonable deal, and I hope they take it, because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant, every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. They'll come down fast. They'll come down easy, and if they don't take the deal, we'll be honored to do so. What is to be done, which should have been done to Iran by every president for the last 47 years. It's time for the Iran killing machine to end. President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, this is just some more gusto from Trump. He always chickens out. He says, "Oh, we're gonna bomb them," but he never really does. And yeah, it just goes to show you that maybe they'll bomb. Maybe there'll be some bombs, but ultimately, I don't think the bombing Armageddon that Trump hints at is going to come anytime soon. But you never know if the U.S. It's always a bit of a wild card what Trump and the government is going to do. I'd say, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have PM Carney declares U.S. ties now a weakness and address to Canadians from tcunews.ca, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I would agree. I kind of agree with that. Ultimately, the U.S. is just a global empire, and Canada is very much a province of it. Canada through neo-imperialism such as NATO, and I personally think Canada should try and be as independent as possible from the U.S., especially when it comes to its economic ties. So I would agree with Carney on that. Personally, I don't think Canada is that. I would argue Canada in some ways is less socially and economically libertarian than the U.S. But I do think they shouldn't be dependent on the U.S. for trade, just like every other country. They gotta focus on themselves first and foremost. Next, we have Israel first mega donor Miriam Adelson gives $40 million to Republican super PACs for midterm elections, proposed by Donald Key, and that cross was from the underreported news subreddit, and that looks like a story from MSN about that. And yeah, I personally just go to show you how politics is very much a money game, and I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately, since money is just a form of speech, politicians should be able to throw however much money they want around to influence politicians and the like, and you don't have to like it, but ultimately, it's just that's how the market works. If people want to throw money at the government, to influence it, I personally don't really care for it, but that's how it works. Reddit doesn't care when it's progressive NGOs; they just care for when it's an outgroup like Israel. And I personally don't really care for Israel, and I really don't care for Miriam Adelson. But ultimately, Reddit only doesn't care for her throwing money at the government because she's more out-group coded than the in-group code currently. They're completely fine when George Soros throws countless money at the government, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have new Hungarian PM says Orban government was using taxpayer money to fund U.S. pro-Trump activist group CPAC. Typical conservative behavior from ibc.co.uk, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, foreign governments, just like other actors, can justify throwing out whatever money they want to influence whoever they want, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump planning jaw-dropping payment to country he bombed, aka Trump surrenders to Iran, from Yahoo.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't know when this Iran stuff's gonna go through, but eventually I think it will go through, and people will move on to whatever the next thing is. People were talking about the Epstein files for a bit, but then now it's Iran. Who knows what the next thing's gonna be? Next, we have Palantir supports compulsory military service, posted by Johnny Porcupine, and that's a screenshot from one of their tweets, and it says, 6, national security service should be universal duty. We should decide seriously moving away from all volunteer force and only fight next war if everyone shares in the risk and the cost. And then the OP added, Peter Field's machine froze the support pine, forcing us to serve the government's imperialist whims, and they had the link to the tweet. And yeah, personally, I think the national service should be voluntary. If you want to serve in the military, you should be able to. Some people who want to serve, like me, I personally can't serve because of the medications I'm taking. But ultimately, I think if people want to serve, they should be able to. But I don't think people should be forced to serve if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have a Florida student was arrested and is now facing up to 15 years in jail for making a joke about Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on WhatsApp. Posted by Woke Man. That's cross-post from a law subreddit, which has since been removed by the moderators of that subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, they just go to show you the government can arrest you for whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. The government can arrest me for what I post or say on this podcast or social media in general, and so maybe sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I personally don't think the state should be arresting the student, but ultimately the government has legal monopoly use of force just by arresting anyone for whatever bullshit reason it feels like, and that's personally why I don't think, they should have that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have map of where it's legal to bid for state contracts of your business or your business is punished if you boycott Israel over their wars. And that's a map of all the states that you can't boycott Israel and not receive government contracts from. And that's the link to the Wikipedia page for anti-BDS laws. And yeah, personally, I think if you want to boycott any country, you should be able to, and you should be able to get a state contract as well. But ultimately, the government, if they don't want to do business with someone because they boycott a country or for any other practice they do, ultimately, like for everything else, they shouldn't be forced to do business with someone they don't want to. I think that's important to remember as well. I personally am pretty anti-Israel, but ultimately, it's just like if every other actor, the government's going to have its preferences on who it doesn't want to work with, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have Schmid versus City of Norfolk brief. Automated license plate readers commit Fourth Amendment searches from Cato.org, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think that they should be doing that, but if the government wants to have that done, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Bonnie may be out, but DOJ's Epstein files cover-up remains from USAtoday.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, if the government wants to cover up the Epstein files, there's usually nothing you can do about it. Next, we have free disasters that legal weed didn't unleash despite the forecast from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think legal weed, it should be treated like alcohol. I don't think it's good for you, and I don't think you should be high all the time. It's like you shouldn't be drunk all the time. But it's very much so. It should be a personal decision what drugs you do and don't take, and that's very much the libertarian position. Next, we have Rep. Roy introduces Mamdani Act to denaturalize and deport Marxists and Islamic fundamentalists from roy.house.gov, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross-post from the law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't think people should be denaturalized and deported just for their beliefs, but ultimately, if the government just wants to justify that, ultimately they have the legal monopoly to force justify whatever they feel like, and that's how the government works. It can justify whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Judge says DOJ and DHS likely coerce tech firms to censor ICE tracking platforms from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but it's like I don't really care for any government censorship of the internet. But Reddit loved government censorship of the internet when Biden was doing it, but now that the orange man's doing it, and it's suddenly the worst thing ever. Next, we have General reportedly blocked Trump from using nuclear codes from MSN.com, posted by Plasman30. And yeah, personally, I don't know if I buy that, but if that is the case, I think Trump's mostly just a figurehead. If he couldn't nuke someone if he wanted to, they say he's accesses nuclear codes, but I think it's really just a distraction. He's really just there to keep people distracted with his WWE style antics rather than actually to lead the country and its military. I think the generals are really the ones who really are leading the military and have access to nuclear codes rather than a figurehead like Trump. Next, we have the Trump administration is worried about high fertilizer prices. Its top trade official lobbied for them from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think that goes against the free market. Fertilizer prices should be determined by the free market, not the state. Next, we have Sovereign Poverty Law Center indicted on federal fraud charges from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, that's crosspost from the NPR subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the Sovereign Poverty Law Center. And I think, they might have been doing some entrapment, just like the feds do when it comes to stuff like Charlottesville and all that. But ultimately, I think they're a private organization. If they want to justify doing fraud, they should be able to. No one's forced to interact with them. They don't want to. And I think that's the libertarian position. You don't have to like the SPCL, but, ultimately they're a private organization. If they want to justify stuff that I personally consider to be unethical, I personally think that's libertarian position is, that people are going to justify what they want to justify. Ultimately, when the government does it, you're forced to interact with the government since they're in control of everything, since they control the law and all that. But, you're not forced to interact with the Sovereign Poverty Law Center if you don't want to. And I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have the myth of libertarianism. None of us reasoning from pure libertarian axioms to specific political positions. The axioms aren't powerful enough. Posted by Lemon Limelight. And they said, Matt Zwolinski tries to explain the current fracture of modern libertarianism. His answer, libertarian was never as philosophically coherent as libertarians have tended to assume. One bit of evidence is this disagreement over something as fundamental as property rights. A commitment to property rights doesn't tell you what property is, how it gets acquired, whether it's inheritable across generations, whether it applies to ideas, whether land is a special case, or what happens when property-based claims conflict. And in my opinion, a hugely important point from that piece, none of us is reasoning from pure libertarian axioms to specific political positions. The axioms aren't powerful enough to do that kind of work, and we aren't disembodied physical agents to begin with. I think that's true. Building a practical philosophy requires more than an axiom and deduction, but I'm less interested in hearing other opinions. How do you build a political philosophy? If an axiom and human reason aren't enough, then what else is needed? And yeah, personally, ultimately, people are going to disagree, have different definitions of everything. I think that's important to remember. Some people might agree on the definition of one thing, but disagree on the definition of another thing, like property, for instance, as the OP mentioned here. I think that's important to remember. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, define words however you want to, as long as you don't justify using force on other people as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have an unintended consequence of U.S. immigration policy. Some fans are skipping the World Cup in the U.S. from edition.cnn.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, Reddit, I guess some fans might skip the World Cup. I do think it's going to be much more successful than Reddit would have you believe. Reddit would have you believe no one's going to attend because of Donald Trump. In reality, I would say the thing that hurts sense most probably isn't Trump or immigration, it's probably how high the ticket prices are, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have no, FDR did not pull America out of the Great Depression from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. FDR and government action, that didn't pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. It was the market that did. But of course, Reddit, they have to always suck FDR's cock, so to speak. And even I think it's interesting. FDR literally threw the Japanese in camps. If Trump threw someone in camps based on their race, Reddit would say, "See, I told you so." But FDR does it, and they just sweep it under the rug. And it just goes to you, Reddit doesn't have any principles other than in group good, out group bad. I'm sure if a president if Trump had a D next to his name, Reddit would love everything he did, but since he has an R next to his name, he's the worst thing ever. Next, we have DOJ charges Sovereign Poverty Law Center fraud over secret funding of extremist groups. The SPLCL's paid informants, field sources, engaged in the active promotion of racist groups at the same time that the SPCL was denouncing the same groups on its website, from CNBC.com, posted by Gnome Sane. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but as I said earlier, we're talking about this, the SPCL can justify doing whatever it feels like. It's a private company. I personally don't think, I don't care for them, and I do I do think they should go out of business because, they're just pretty much a DNC propaganda arm of the DNC, just like, Media Matters is. But, ultimately, if they want to justify, undercover agents in racist groups that claims to be against, ultimately, people are going to justify. I personally don't care for it, but I think libertarian positions, the state shouldn't be charging them for it. I think the market should be the one determining it. I think the market should be the one putting the Sovereign Poverty Law Center out of business rather than the state. Next, we have Smoking Ban for People Born After 2008 from YouTube.com, posted by Dry Veterinarian 2438, and that's a video from Luo on YouTube, Smoking Ban for People Born After 2008. And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting. Reddit hates tobacco and thinks and says, oh, it's cancer sticks. You shouldn't be smoking tobacco. Yet when it comes to weed, it's like, oh, we love weed. Why can't the state let people enjoy what they want to enjoy? Ultimately, it just goes to show you, Reddit only cares what's in group coded or out group coded. Since tobacco is more out group coded, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. Well, since weed is more in group coded, Reddit thinks it's the best thing ever. But I think the libertarian position is, if you wanted to smoke tobacco, you should be able to. If you want to smoke weed, you should be able to smoke or inhale or do whatever you want with your own body. It's your body, not my body. Live and let live, as long as you're not hurting anyone else or otherwise infringing on their rights. Next, we have How Do You Discover Libertarian Ideas posted by Jacob Anders. And that's a picture of George W. Bush, and they said, I was 9 years old, 9/11. It was 4 days for my birthday, and thankfully Mom kept life normal for me. The nation rallied for war against Afghanistan and Iraq. In my eyes, the war was only good for things like George Washington freeing us from the Britain or Abraham Lincoln fighting the Confederacy. The adults in my life didn't talk about it to me. The teachers definitely didn't either. In 2004, I was 11 years old, and somehow a huge Jib Jab fan. I was forever John Kerry won free purple hearts, and I was the eternal governor. I was way too online for a middle schooler, but it is what it is. At age 12, I watched the nation re-elect George W. Bush, who at the time I considered the worst president in history. I started learning that all the adults around me were utter morons. How could I, a child, be making more informed voting decisions than people 18 up? The radicalization began. I was 15 years old when Ron Paul declared his candidacy for president in 2008. He watched most of what I liked about libertarian philosophy: repeal the Patriot Act, end the war on drugs, cutting taxes. More importantly, Paul was the only Republican candidate to oppose the Iraq War from its inception and called for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from abroad. Imagine my heartbreak when the voters rejected Ron Paul in favor of Huckabee, Romney, and McCain. From that day forth, I rejected the Republican Party, at least little good I had toward it. I shifted to Team Obama against Clinton due to her pro-war Iraq vote. Felt a bit vindicated when we won that primary. Felt major indication when we whooped John McCain's butt back in Arizona. I was eager to see what Obama would get done, but unfortunately his own party opposed nearly every damn thing he wanted to do. Instead of himself figure out a terrible bill called Obamacare. It's not even Obama's original vision, but his name is forever on it. He also didn't end the wars. I wasn't a weed smoker, but my friends were, and I was eager to see the drug war ended. It didn't. The Republicans took over Congress in 2010, and Obama didn't get to do anything of substance. I got so damn radicalized I was considering marrying a Canadian European to get away from just how dumb the country had become. Then Bernie Sanders came along in 2015, and the rest is history. And yeah, personally, I would agree with some of that. It just goes to, Obama marketed himself as this big agent of change, but ultimately Washington never changes. The deep state's always going to be the one really in control of that, and it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter who's in control. You do have a few good people in there, like Ron Paul, as the OP mentioned, but regardless, ultimately the state is going to be keep going. And regardless of which figurehead is in power, I'm sure if a libertarian ever got under like a Ron Paul or a Thomas Massie, the state would take them out in like less than a month. That's how the state works. If that they would never let a libertarian run the country. Because that they might actually try and reduce the size of government, and the size of government only grows regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Tariffs are driving up homeowners insurance premiums from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tariffs, but if people want to pay them, they should be able to. If they don't, they shouldn't be forced to do so. Spirit Airlines close to $500 million bailout from Trump administration. CNN Business from CNN.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the libertarian position, the libertarians should be against bailouts. Companies shouldn't be too big to fail. If they fail, if they're failing, the government shouldn't be the ones bailing them out. They should be failing and going out of business rather than having the government bailing them out. And that's my thoughts there. And there's supposed to wanted to share what I did to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. First I said libertarian perspectives on HOAs. I said So I'm staying here for a friend of my father's out in Kansas for the next couple of days, and turns out he's the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Personally, I think the HOAs tend to be one of the biggest forms of petty tyranny outside perhaps being a Reddit moderator. I think as long as they're voluntary, that they can be okay, but oftentimes they aren't. I guess you can make the argument that you're free to live in a neighborhood that doesn't have an HOA if you don't want to, but I personally think that even if you do live in a neighborhood that has one, you should be able to opt out of it if you feel like it. Like everything else, I think it should be up to individual choice first and foremost. Thoughts? And that's my thoughts on that one. Now he said, do you think the future will be more or less libertarian than the present, particularly in regards to the U.S.? And I said, so I went to Truman's Presidential Library today, and one of the things they had for the 250th anniversary of the country was what would do we wish for the next 250 years. You can't read my middle handwriting in second image. I said, for the American Empire to perish, and for the American Republic to be restored. And I linked to my tweet saying that. They got me thinking about if the U.S. 250 years from now will be more or less libertarian than the U.S. of today. In some ways, I would say the U.S. is much more libertarian today than it was 250 years ago, but not so much as much in other ways. A good way that I have heard put is that the founding fathers rebelled and risked their lives seeking for a government that is smaller than the U.S. has today. Ultimately, I guess we have to see what happens, but it's more of us take initiatives to make sure that society as a whole remains as libertarian as possible as long as we walk the earth. Thoughts? And then I also added, you guys might also notice my response to Truman's justification of the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the first image, which I think set a very bad precedent, which Truman definitely said a lot of, particularly in regards to foreign affairs. Here's some other bad ones I think he said. Was the U.S. president who first recognized the state of Israel and opened up that whole can of worms? They had an entire museum dedicated to this. The Marshall Plan, though well-intentioned, led the U.S. to justify spending countless money on foreign aid in the decades to follow. His handling of Korea without having Congress declare war that set the precedent that the U.S. was free to get involved in any conflict it felt, so based solely on what the executive branch wanted to justify. The CIA is created during his tenure. I'll give him some points for his segregating the military, but that's about it. He also probably directly killed the most people of any U.S. presidency. He was a mortar man during World War I. And then finally, I have libertarian perspectives on the American dream. So I just got back from my trip to Kansas, and on the right back from the airport, me and my father talked to the driver for a bit. He was originally from the country of Algeria and was asked when we were on to the U.S. He replied, the American dream. I think a lot of people tend to be rather cynical, which that is brought up today, but I definitely do think it still exists. In a lot of other countries, there's much more social hierarchy compared to the U.S. I think that's what people from all over the globe still try and come here, even if immigration restrictions might make it hard to do so. Thoughts? And yeah, personally, I think, Reddit, of course, always looks down on the U.S. a lot of the time, but I do think it's probably one of the most libertarian societies there is. You have more opportunities in a lot of other countries, and if you don't like it, you're free to create your own opportunities as well. As when I went to Kansas City, me and my dad and his friend went to the Negro League Baseball Museum. They had to have the opportunity to play in the MLB since it was segregated at the time, so they started their own league. And I think that's very much how libertarians work. If opportunities aren't there, you should make them for yourself, and that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. No, wait, we have a new one. Houston irks Texas Governor Greg Abbott by reminding cops to comply with the 4th Amendment for Reason.com, posted by Johnny Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the state should be complying with all the amendments, but ultimately, the Bill of Rights, just like with the Constitution and all the other founding documents, they're much more of a suggestion than an actual law. Reddit is fine when the government walks over them when it has the correct letter next to its name. It's interesting. Reddit doesn't care at all about them when their party's in power, but suddenly the opposing party's in power and they're the most important thing ever. It just goes to show you that people don't have any consistent values. I think we should be following the Bill of Rights and Constitution, but ultimately the state, they really don't seem to care for it, regardless of which branch of the party's in power. Yet Reddit only cares when the out group goes against them rather than the in group. When the in group can violate them as many times as it feels like, and Reddit would never dare call them out for it. And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.